Today we're going to go further into this 2017 anthology, Human Origins, trying to answer the question, what is it that makes us human? Which is the series that I've been doing. I have two more sections left in the chapter by Roy Allen, who's, I don't know, what was he, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at University of Kent. And I'm really enjoying his work. So I'm going to give a summary for a couple of minutes and then try to get into it. Yeah, again, trying to answer this question of what is it that makes humans human? We sort of settled on as kind of analysis of prehistory, right? So this kind of combination of Darwinian modeling into deep time that allows us to work out what is it about humans as distinct from other kinds of species, and then also using this social anthropology, this like ethnographic data, to talk about kind of cross-cultural convergence on the core of human culture, this sort of thing. And a combination of these different kinds of models helps us to hone in on essentially the essence of humanity. And to what we derive from that is this kind of and yeah, through Ellen's work, I mean, it's not me that's doing that, is this understanding that it's like the different ways that we organize our knowledge of nature. So our social cognition, the ways that we specifically derive information about the natural world, and then pool that information, share it. And what we needed in order to do that was so the empathic recognition of agency, so that someone else is a, you know, intentional agent that has valuable information that they're trying to share. So we had agency that allows us to establish trust and share knowledge with each other. That allows that knowledge to be distributed throughout the human collective, and then updated. So we have this, it's particularly about renegotiating category boundaries. So we have this amazing ability to categorize, to classify, to taxonomize, to understand the natural world by simplifying uh, the complexity into more simple categories that allows us to act efficiently. But then this is a kind of dichotomizing tendency that we see through other kinds of species as well. For example, these very basic categories like predator or prey, same species or different species, toxic or non-toxic, male or female. Um, yeah, these are very ancient kinds of categories, and the risk is that if we, because humans can do this as well, right? Like dividing the world into these like black and white, either or dichotomizing boxes. The risk is that this it risks only seeing the world through a certain lens or a certain model. And what humans worked out how to do is basically to derive information about categories from different people's experiences, episodic experiences, but then to renegotiate the boundaries between those categories. So to um, update our cultural knowledge, to iterate on what something is, to where the boundaries are between what things are. And that basically allows us this distributed cognition and collective intelligence has this kind of resiliency. It's not just about efficiency in relation to simplifying the environment. It's also about having a resilient culture in the face of the rapidly changing nature of that environment, right? So it's like, yes, it's helpful to simplify the world by classifying and categorizing the world in using similarity judgments, analogical reasoning, like, oh, I can understand this thing because it's like this other thing that I know. This is kind of symbolic cognition. It's by analogy that we understand. This is a very efficient way of thinking, um, and that allows us to derive these the essences of these different categories, which are kind of archetypal. A quick example of that is that a heron or a starling is kind of closer to the essence of the category of bird than a penguin. Like penguins are not very good birds, let's say, but they still fit into the bird category. Um, and so we have this ability to see these natural kinds, natural categories that seem cross-culturally valid in some way, because the inferences that we draw about what something is are based on its relevance, about how we as humans relate to it, and our taxonomizing, our naming, our classifying and categorizing are all derived from our embodied experience. So we understand the world by relating to it from out of our own body and from out of the social body. But it's particularly, again, I noticed, I shared how a lot of that other species also know how to do. It's particularly the human ability to renegotiate our category boundaries in the face of a changing world. So that, for example, a quick example is something like fire. If we fell into the the trap of relating to fire as like, oh, that's something dangerous that can burn us, right? It's like, well, that's true, but if we renegotiate and share a bit more about people's different experiences with fire, then we can understand that it is that, but it is also something that can help to cook our food, for example, or to um, uh, regenerate the plant life, the earth, when it passes through a certain area. Um, so that's a little bit about the different elements that go into human groups, particularly. This is like the core of human cognition, is this ability to not only um, have an efficient way of relating with the natural world by deriving these natural categories, classification, taxonomy is by using these similarity judgments and analogical reasoning, simplifying the world into these kind of archetypal categories, but then to adjust those and to um, yeah, it's like as I've talked about, like reweaving the different stories, the different boundaries that we draw between different elements of nature as needed, right? So this is kind of this is what makes resilient culture, essentially. Um, okay, then from there, we also saw we're wanting to explore a little bit about, like I mentioned, how knowledge is, we've talked about how knowledge is derived from the natural world by people's direct experience. And then we talked about um, how we find these kind of natural classifications that kind of pool into archetypal groups, right? I talked about not only knowledge gathering and knowledge updating, so like the iteration of culture, but also knowledge storage, so storage in the distributed cognition of the collective intelligence of the group of humans, right? And archetypal memory, being able to remember the gist of stories, the essence of what someone is talking about, um, was extremely helpful because it allowed us to not need to remember everything that someone is saying. Um, so that's the way that archetypal memory was relevant to what's unique about human cognition in particular, because other kinds of creatures, they can do this episodic like recall of different events that happen. But in order to make these classification judgments, that like to have these more abstract, higher order categories that simplify the natural world, we really need to be able to remember archetypally. We need to be able to distill the essence of many different kinds of stories to work out in an archetypal or essential way what something is, like what's the gist of what something is, what kind of thing is it. So we can see how archetypal memory is connected to the, at least hypothesized, essence of different categories, and how that's a very efficient way of storing knowledge that makes humans different from other kinds of creatures. That was about archetypal memory. Where we're wanting to go from here, we talked a bit about analogical reasoning, and that takes us directly into symbolic cognition. So it's something about, in particular, about our language and the evolution of that language that allows us to update and reiterate our cultural knowledge. Although, interestingly, we also saw that this ability that humans have to sort of metabolize these different dichotomies within the social body actually evolved before higher order language did. Higher order language is sort of very recent in the last like 60,000 years or so, whereas this the human thing that we've been doing of like renegotiating these category boundaries is something that we've been doing for quite a bit longer. And so the relationship with language there is quite interesting. It seems to be something that um, is happening beneath the level of our uh, language sharing. It's like language is sort of built on top of that in a certain way. So I'm wanting to draw out a bit more of what are the specifics of symbolic cognition that allowed us to um, be so amazing in the natural world? Like, can we understand a bit more about the analogical way of thinking and how symbolic cognition became important and how that relates with our use of language? But then also we were talking about the left hemisphere of the brain and essentially how this core of human cognition can basically become derailed. And it became derailed as a result of the relationship between the hand-based manipulation of the world and the sense of self, the sense of awareness, and particularly the relationship with tools or techne that comes from that connection between our hands and relating to the world in the left hemispheric way, as if everything is an object. Again, it's an as if that as if is actually a symbolic or analogical jump. We relate to the natural world and to other people if we're coming from the left hemisphere, as if those are objects to be moved around and manipulated, and um, they're actually not, right? That's a story that we tell ourselves when we become disconnected from the core of the human community. Um, if I just pause and reflect a little bit more on the hand, the hand allowed us to, yeah, it really brought about it. What Ellen says is that it brings about a whole transformation in the relationship between hominins and their own body, like a greater level of physical self-awareness, a change in our sense of self. The hands became used a lot in, I mean, you can see me doing it with gesture right here, right, as sensory organs, and so um, this really changed a lot of how we related to the natural world itself. And that can be, I mean, this is why, for example, Viveki is using all these metaphors that have to do with touch, being in deeper contact with reality itself, which is a profound ability. Like our use of our hands, and particularly hand-eye coordination, was like really essential for humans to be humans, right? It's when that the particular technical and intelligence or tool making and tool using capacity becomes sort of disconnected in a kind of, I would connect that with sort of unregulated shadow, a lack of, um, yeah, dissolving of the ego structure, and yeah, sort of warlike tendency that where let's say males that are more technically intelligent become sort of disconnected from the group itself. That can sort of spiral off into what ultimately becomes a technology-derived breaking of the co-selection dynamics between humans and nature itself, where we suddenly start being able to overhunt all these animals in all different environments, and then get these runaway arms race dynamics that lead to these there's a multipolar trap that we essentially see in the world today. Like, oh, we have to all build these nuclear missiles and AI weapons and bioweapons because the other guys are doing it. And when we can't have this, uh, recognition of a common, literally common ground, common earth that we all share, and shared trust, and transparency, then um, we get stuck in those. Uh, yeah, game theory traps, social traps, as Schmartenberger, among other people, have laid out. So the question be, can we redress that? Can we use a kind of a wisdom school model, neo-indigenous culture? I don't know how to articulate that model of like, hey, can we bring back some of the functionality of the right hemisphere here by prescribing? Let's take a deeper look at this, not only analogical reasoning, but symbolic cognition, as connected with archetypal memory and the capacity to renegotiate category boundaries. Is there some way that we can sort of take that and then um, take our intention and our focus and our energy back to that way of relating with each other and relating with being itself? And so this is why, like the intention to sort of redress some of the way that modern culture, I would say, since the um, over proliferation of stone tool use, circa like 3.4 million years ago or so, has happened. What can we do so as to essentially get back to beneath the layer of duality? What can we do to repair all these different splits, conflicts, polarities, dualities that we see in modern human culture? Is there a way that we can restore our access to the source of life, to again the core of human cognition, what it is that makes humans unique, as a way to begin to transmute, metabolize, or alchemize those different categories to the different polarities that we see? Can we renegotiate uh, the world that we're living in, and hopefully thrive and survive and have our humanity restored to us? That would be the, let's say, ultimate goal, or enough of an ultimate goal to continue. And that's what allows me to move further into the remaining two sections of Roy Ellen's fantastic paper, which is again called Rethinking the Relationship Between Ethnobiological Knowledge and the Evolution of Human Cultural Cognition. I looked at the sections, skipped the introduction because it was boring. We talked about the cognition of the biological world. We talked about physical evidence for biological knowledge during the Pleistocene. We talked about, yeah, different models of intelligence. So it's called the ethnobiological turn and modeling modularity. To get into some ethnography. And then we started talking about this nature social mutuality, this social cognition. Then we were talking about knowledge sharing and knowledge distribution. This is the stuff about distributed cognition and collective intelligence. We then started talking about the stuff about archetypal memory and episodic and mimetic memory in relation to analogical reasoning, similarity judgments, categorization, as well as trust agency and knowledge sharing. And so now what I get to talk about after all that is the section entitled Language, Naming, and Symbolic Culture. And again, I'm going to be using this rather tortured methodology where I'm going to still, because it's quite dense academic, intellectual writing, at least from my point of view, and I'm going to read out each paragraph and hopefully gainfully comment on what it has to say. So, um, I guess the opening question here would be, can we understand a little bit more about the co-evolving feedback loop between our um, social cognition and our knowledge of the natural world? Okay, so the first paragraph goes, it is now widely accepted that language, primarily speech-based and using words in a structured and conventional way, evolved primarily to enhance sociality rather than technical communication, and co-evolved with symbolic culture more generally. By symbolic culture, I understand sharing and transmission mediated through the use of symbols, concepts, or things standing for each other, often in an arbitrary relationship. Using a system of social categories, for example, this allowed for kin connections and extended social links beyond the immediate present, even when relevant individuals were physically absent. However, the evidence of macroanatomy indicates that symbolic capacity evolved before any archaeological evidence is found in early Homo species to support it. This suggests that it did not immediately translate into symbolic culture. The mimetic culture or archetypal culture that developed during this period would have likely been sufficient to support proto-language capacity that involved categorization and proto-naming of the natural world in the way I've already outlined. Okay, what is this saying? The key point was that the evolution of our language enhanced our sociality, our sociability, and also our social cognition. Um, and it co-evolved with our symbolic culture. So language and symbolic culture seem to go together in some way to co-evolve. But we see that this symbolic capacity that we had that evolved before the evidence from the development of our brains suggested that our capacity for that way of thinking evolved before we have physical evidence of it. And that sort of suggests that we um, went through a period of having kind of proto-language, a kind of pre-language abilities that involved some categorization and some proto-naming before we got to full language. As I was saying, that the development of full language seems to be a very recent ability. And we see here a clear focus on the use of symbols, the use of something to stand for something else, as a way of connecting things which would otherwise not be connected. And the key example of that was role taking, role filling, role assigning. So by having these social categories, for example, mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, or elder, you could say, a child, categories like nieces, nephews, uncles, aunties, this kind of whole complex web of roles that people can take are social categories, where um, this there's a connection here between our use of symbols and things standing for each other, which allows the relationship between these categories, right? Um, so there's clearly a deep connection between like the use of symbols and categorization itself. What else did I say? I also said that our social categories are connected to archetypal role taking, role filling, and role assigning, which leads to kinship networks, which are complex and intertribal. What do I mean by that? So if we can assign these roles and take up these social roles in relation with the group, right? This essentially helps us to simplify the social field, but it also helps us to extend that social field again with individuals who are not physically present. So extend that social field through space, but also through time, like intergenerationally, right? And so this way of there's a clear connection here between sort of yeah, social categorization and what I'm going to call, yes, it's symbolic thought, symbolic reasoning, or archetypal reasoning. It's relating from within and from out of those categories to other categories, right? This is what leads to these complex kinship networks that we, for example, we see across the continent of Australia in indigenous different tribal groups had these very complex kinship relationships with each other that leads to a um, massive intertribal resiliency framework. Essentially, like if you've through exogamy married out a lot of people to the neighboring tribes, you're going to be much less likely to have a war with those tribes, right? We see how social categories and again symbolic cognition is key to facilitating that. We also saw how this is connected to collective memory. So again, it's this. This is really from the last episode. We saw how this um, thinking symbolically, like being able to categorize, being able to remember um, the archetypal essence of something, remember the gist. It allows for the formation of these categories, socially or otherwise, and that allows us to draw on this kind of what I'm calling collective memory. I mean, this is pretty close to Jung's collective unconscious, but it's basically like that we have this kind of distributed cognition, this collective intelligence, which is across space and across time. So by collective memory, a simple way of thinking of that is that we can read these books. Thankfully, Roy Allen is still with us, but I can read books from a long time ago from people who are no longer with us. And so this is a way that we have this collective memory, right? That is both spatially distributed, as in Roy Allen is not right here with me, but I can read what he has to say. And I could read, for example, the works of Plato, who's no longer with us, but we can remember what he had to say. Um, yeah, it's our symbolic cognition that was originally allowing this. Um, that means these social categories, they're also connected with obviously our knowledge transmission. There's also a clear link to ancestor worship there. It's like our collective memory. This is sort of reminding me of Mircea Eliada's like the eternal return. It's a um, returning to this primordial time where we can remember or download whatever information that we need from the collective memory, from the body of the group. I think ancestor worship, which we see pretty much across the whole world, would clearly go along with that because the ancestors are perceived to be, let's say, spiritual entities that are the ones holding that knowledge, holding that memory. Um, yeah, highly distributed cognition. Okay, that's pretty much just a summary of the first paragraph. Yeah, I just clarify that like our categorization of the natural world and our proto-naming of those categories, like before we get very complex taxonomy, for example, that's early forms of our symbolic cognition. Okay, second paragraph. It goes, while sharing practices and cognitive skills can improve without language, progressive language skills improve both. Language depends upon and fosters the ability to imagine what is in other people's minds, to make assumptions as to how they will cognize shared data. This is achieved through treating shared fictions as objective facts, using names that can stand for generalized abstract entities in an environment and mean sufficiently the same for both parties in a conversation. Some simple names may well have been onomatopoeic, and onomatopoeia is still strongly represented for certain groups of animals, for example, birds and frogs. But the process of agreeing shared meanings in itself can lead to lexemes becoming arbitrary. In some cases, as Berlin in 2006 has shown, the non-arbitrariness of the relation of sounds to animals they represent can be remarkably consistent. But it is not only names for things that are required for this process to work, but descriptions of attributes of things. For example, taste, in the case of plants and animals used for food, as distinctive features become increasingly important for enforcing category boundaries. Okay, again, a lot of information was presented. What does it mean? A fair way of summarizing that, I think, would be obviously that language improves our sharing, improves our sociality, and improves our cognition itself. We also see that, yeah, it's the particularly the social agreement about distinctive features of things, the social agreement about what something is as distinct from other things or as similar to other things. That's the most important capacity for maintaining and updating our category boundaries, the limits of our classification system, so we can decide socially, hey, what is this thing? Which category should it fit into, right? Well, it's our ability to socially agree on what are the features of something that allow for that. Um, yeah, and again, there was this focus on, I mean, yeah, Henry Corbin's the imaginal, like the imaginal world. It's like treating our narratives as objective facts, being able to draw on these categories, which we make up, right? We draw up these categories based on our reasoning, based on our shared sense of um, what categories things fit into. I don't know. How would I articulate that? Well, this is stuff about archetypal memory. It's like, well, is that inherent in the natural world, or is it something that we project? It's too complex to go into whether it's neither, and it's a bit of both. Um, yeah, transjectivity. Anyway, the other point that I wanted to make here briefly is we saw mindsight, right? This capacity to empathize. Language depends upon and fosters the ability to imagine what is in other people's minds. Now, this and again, I think that can be like risky. That can go both ways, right? Like if we're imagining what is in someone's mind, it can actually take us away. It can take us up into our mind or into our story and away from direct connection, direct perception of what's actually going on with that person and for them, away from connection. And so I want to say it's about shared maintenance of the imaginal world. When the group gives its shared energy and the shared sense making of that group to maintain and update the categories, the archetypal categories, and the relationships between them, then we get this the functionality of simplifying the world in that way and being able to update those simplifications as needed. But when we do that in a way that actually takes us away from connecting with other people, then I think we're starting to fantasize and starting to go away from what's real rather than further toward what's real. So the imaginal can sort of spiral off into just pure fantasy, pure imagining, or imagination as we've conceived it. But the imaginal is about more deeply connecting with what is actually real, like to the essence of what's real, right? To agree on what these archetypal categories are. Okay, I'm going to go into the third paragraph, which says, agreeing names and thereafter a consistent semantic association between names and generalizations about entities in an environment requires shared acceptance of a set of rules for meaning making. Most ethnobiological data is collected by asking informants what they call things. Although there are methodological dangers here, names are a reasonable proxy for knowledge. And in recognizing this, we identify the reasons why names were introduced in the first place, not only to increase the reliability of sharing knowledge, but as better triggers for inference. While it's possible to imagine the collective imposition of rules without language, rules are much more effectively recognized and enforced with a language that facilitates sharing knowledge, generalizing it, and agreeing on notions of right and wrong, and encoding this into a moral framework. Thus, one-way rule behavior is embedded through introducing an emotional charge to our interpretation of what is embedded in long-term memory. By making something right, shared rules of recognition and behavior are reinforced, authority is established. There's a link between enculturation of the mind, classification, and social morality. Okay, again, a lot was just presented. What does this mean? Naming things is really, really useful. It really simplifies things. It allows us to draw inferences about what something is by sharing a minute amount of information. Um, and so it seems that morality itself uh, co-evolved or is deeply linked to the evolution of language, the relevance of our emotion to the cultural embeddedness of our knowledge, and our category boundary. So like once we've decided what something is, when we give that a when we give a moral charge to our like when we give a an emotional um an emotional charge when we allow our emotions to support our understanding of what something is and what something is not, this allows us to deeply embed our knowledge. Like it's really reinforced into our long-term memory. This is what it is. And language really facilitates creating rules, creating structures around our categories that help us to maintain uh, a moral framework. We also saw how the knowledge sharing was really dependent on that incipient or emergent morality, the establishment of trust, the recognition of shared agency through empathy. The emergence of morality seems to go along with that. This is the evolution of right and wrong as shared social categories that help us to establish and maintain categories, boundaries between what something is and what it is not. And interestingly, I would say I won't comment further on this at the moment, but to me, I'm noticing um, there's a clear role for femininity here, I think. I think like again, like some people are really not going to like that, but to me, that's just quite obvious. For me, there's a clear connection between like essentially it's the origins of cancel culture, right? It's the origins of language as a way of dividing and classifying the world, agreeing on shared moral frameworks, but also updating those moral frameworks, um, rewiring what something is and what something isn't, and the important role for emotion and for naming in that. These are clearly, for me, clearly all essentially more connected with yin qualities or feminine qualities is what I'm calling here. But again, a lot of people won't like that. That's okay with me. Okay, I'm going to do the fourth paragraph, which is quite short. It says, speech acts concerning aspects of the biological world occur not only in particular physical contexts that reinforce the meaning of names, but in the context of different kinds of social relations. In some cases, there is a mutual exchange of words, but sometimes it is deliberately instructional. Pedagogy, therefore, becomes an increasingly efficient form of cultural transmission with the development of language and higher orders of intentionality, but not at the expense of self-learning. Okay, this is talking about this feedback between those kinship structures, like the social categories that we form. There seems to be a feedback relationship between those kinship structures and our updating, our knowledge sharing, our knowledge transmission, right? So our social cognition, and particularly the symbolic aspect, like the analogical reasoning, symbolic reasoning, this aspect of our social cognition. This allowed us to form those kinship structures in the first place through creating social categories, but it also means that those social categories can feed back into a much more efficient cultural through line of transmission. Again, I would draw it from the work of Zach Stein and other educational theorists who really point out how the maintenance of this intergenerational link between the eldership generation and the young generation. That's the whole point of that's what middle-aged people are supposed to be doing, is maintaining this cultural link. That's really the core of what pedagogy, cultural transmission is about. Um, I think we can see how that's connected not just with efficiency of knowledge sharing, but also with resilient cultures that don't just have cultures that don't have good pedagogy, that don't have good education of the young by the elderly, are unlikely to last for very long. Um, they might be slightly downregulated in an environment with a lot of change because basically the eldership is to, derive the knowledge about what has been for the longest time, more so than adapting to what's new. Young people have far more fluid IQ and therefore are better able to adapt to the situation as it is. And in an environment of hyper novelty, there is definitely a premium on youth in that way. That's all quite clear. I'm going to move to the next paragraph, which is 5 of 7. And it's a long one. I might go halfway. So it says, symbolic language also makes possible environmental narrativity, the ability to recall events and processes, and tell stories about plants, animals, and their maturation in particular places, both in the specific and in the general. This has an obvious positive effect on harvesting efficiency. The idea of narrativity as an essential component of symbolic culture was first introduced by Michael Carruthers in 1990, but has been elaborated by Alan Barnard in 2013 in what he calls his second theory. What is interesting about narrativity in terms of the evolution of biocognition is that it involves a significant role for episodic memory in the organization of resource and spatial knowledge, but in the context of a linguistic capacity that allows for generalization about particular kinds of environment and an ability to infer what kinds of resources might be found in what kind of habitat. It also permits abstract narratives that combine biological and social knowledge in imaginative ways of the kind we call myths. Okay, again, a lot of information was just presented. What does it mean? So, our symbolic language enables our storytelling. We need our symbolic cognition and particularly our analogical speaking as if something is another thing by analogy. This is the core of symbolic cognition and particularly the symbolic use of language that really enabled our storytelling. And stories are a highly efficient, again, and obviously promoting is really resiliency as well. I think we can see from here um, for knowledge transmission. And particularly because of that, it involves clearly, like when we tell stories, it's about our episodes, our episodic memory, right? And that's a part of how we um, organize our knowledge of where resources are, for example. Um, but it also allows us, like it's quite specific about what is in which place, but it's also a general capacity. It allows us to generalize about different kinds of environments. So now storytelling seems to be promoting this flexibility, this again modularity between generalization and specialization of in the kinds of places that we like to go to, right? Yeah, and also to infer about kinds of resources. Yeah, and then narrative also involves, yeah, so narrative involves this specific episodes and generalized inferences. So it's this combination. Okay, then we moved it. Yeah, it's yeah, social knowledge transmitted through myth is the kind of I think myth here I would connect with a kind of deeper transmission between archetypal categories. There's a way that when I think about the relationship between myth and story, right? Myths in some way are deeper. Myths in some way cut closer to the core or deeper to the essence of what life is about. It's like I would connect that with a deeper or more foundational, more fundamental transmission between and relationship between our different archetypal categories. Um, I won't talk more about the difference between myth and story here. I'm going to read the rest of the paragraph, which says, I'll just read it again. It says, it also permits, this is symbolic language, it also permits abstract narratives that combine biological and social knowledge in imaginative ways of the kind we call myths. Such narratives can only work by using names to generalize about species and habitats. But it is notable that with ethno-ecological categories, we do not find the same kinds of complex, lexically embedded classifications that we find for the separate domains of plants and animals. Instead, we find that knowledge of physical landscape is culturally embedded by using narratives of particular places and myth that enhance memorability and provides moral reinforcement, among other things. Moreover, this integration of culture and environment is all the more powerful because even before the Holocene human groups were self-evidently making their environment physically cultural, for example, by creating resource-rich patches through inadvertent dropping of seed, selective extraction, and camp trail making, and camp and trail making. I'm going to read that part again. Instead, we find that knowledge of physical landscape is culturally embedded by using narratives of particular places in myth that enhance memorability and provides moral reinforcement. Moreover, this integration of culture and environment is all the more powerful because even before the Holocene, human groups were self-evidently making their environment physically cultural. For example, by creating resource-rich patches through inadvertent dropping of seed, collective extraction, selective extraction, and camp and trail making. Non-linguistic episodic memory is thus transformed through language into more effective edited accounts that can be better shared. Wow, okay, so much was just presented here. One way of simplifying this would be simply to say that stories deeply integrate our cultural knowledge and our natural knowledge, our knowledge of the natural world. We see this, how stories and myth telling allows for this deep interrelationship between our knowledge of like physical landscape, what different places are like, what we find in those different places, and the stories that we tell about them, right? Um, the meaning of those different places, the the implication of those places for our cultural practice, for our way of life, right? We see how, for example, this is deeply tied with the concept of seasonality. It's like, well, now is the kind of time to be in this place because this is what kinds of plants are here, this sort of a thing, right? The stories that we tell, the myths that we tell about um, uh, what certain places mean, the significance of certain places. This is so obviously connected with narrative and myth making, right? But it's also deeply connected with the um, how we relate with the natural world, literally about where we go and what we do. To the extent that we were functionally designing in the sense of making our environment physically cultural. Okay, two more short paragraphs to finish this section. It says, with the ability to convey and store messages about abstract natural kinds, it becomes in principle possible to construct categories of increasing inclusiveness or increasing abstraction through aggregation of categories, or to construct categories through decreasing abstraction, decreasing inclusiveness towards segregation or differentiation. Berlin in 1972 showed that classification, in terms of shared named basic categories, evolves, classification evolves from the middle outwards. From the middle outwards, meaning our classification is based on immediate relevance, what's immediately relevant about something, and we classify down into more specific layers, and then up into more abstracted and general layers, aggregated layers. So our classification evolves from the middle outwards, both ontogenetically in an individual's life. For example, we learn the term cat before we learn the term Siamese. We learn the term cat before we learn the term feline or mammal. And that's ontogenetically in terms of individual development, but that's also true historically. Like across deep time among human groups. Okay, so when we say it evolves from the middle outwards, that core, that middle, as Berlin has also shown, it comprises around 5 to 600 generic categories in all recorded ethnobiological classification systems, with the total number of taxa altogether reaching approximately 2,000. The process depends on notions of ranking and taxonomy that may have evolved independently of biocognition as a means of contrasting and grouping various kinds of entity, and as a response to the difficulties of recalling large numbers of similar items. Such procedures are enabled by a syntax that can repeatedly embed adjectives and phrases, and a recursiveness that gives form to more complex classificatory structures. Yeah, so again, it's this the function of language here is to enable this flexibility between specializing or differentiating to many different kinds of categories, getting very specific down to all the unique individual things, but also to aggregate, to derive these more general categories, grouping into various kinds of entity. And this complexifying uh, functionality of our symbolic language enabled us to adjust to how general or how specific our categories needed to be, given how the land, the environment, nature itself was changing. Final paragraph is short. The convergence of language, social nature mutuality, imagination, and abstraction permitted plants and animals to be spoken of in multi-referential ways as part of networks of meaning. This reinforced knowledge about them, but also increased their symbolic functionality in other social contexts through analogical reasoning. For example, use of male, female, which we see, male, female terms all throughout, for example, the French language, but also through genealogical metaphors like families, brothers, mother of. These terms are all deeply embedded in our taxonomy, right? The very notion of hierarchy is also deeply connected with our taxonomizing, naming of the natural world. But also, yeah, this when we put our terms in networks of meaning, it not only increases symbolic functionality, but also increases our ability to animate things, to, I would say, to reveal or unveil the inherent animation of the world of life. Allows us to get closer to what things really are, to be able to understand them with this flexibility of generalizing and specifying, um, differentiating and aggregating. Yeah, so animation and the personification, particularly of biological types. This is the putting flesh on the bones, so to speak, of the archetypes. Again, the functionality of the imaginal world of our imagination, of our imagistic thinking and our analogical reasoning. This is all deeply functional because it allowed us to um, personify and experience the relationships between the different categories that we were making, and also to adjust them, to adjust these relationships archetypally or in archetypal terms, in familial terms even, especially as we start to use, again, it was talking about families, brothers, mothers, fathers, this sort of thing. The social categories are the oldest, and that's why we see the archetypes of, for example, the father and the mother and the son, um, as being some of the deepest that we have, because they're the oldest. Okay, so that was the section entitled Language, Naming, and Symbolic Culture. We started to zero in on the functionality of the imaginal world of like what is it that makes us human, right? And the answer is this relationship between our social cognition and our natural knowledge, not only our ability to create our categories, create our classification systems, but also to update them, to iterate them. And we do that not only through sharing our knowledge, storing that knowledge archetypally and socially, but also through this complexifying dynamic, not only in our kinship structures, in our social categories, But by applying our um, categorizing and recategorizing way of thinking to relationship, embodied relationship, being in touch with the natural world as it changes. This is how we do the human thing. Yeah, storytelling, symbolic language, analogical reasoning, kinship networks, um, social categories, language, especially symbolic language, although categorization evolved long beforehand, so did social cognition. Mind sight, again, this capacity through language to connect, to empathize with the other, to see the agency and intentionality of another. Naming, the specificity and generalizability of our naming, and the classes of things. Yeah. Relating specific episodes of what happened and our generalized influence. Sorry, our generalized inference about what something is, about what happened, the gist or the moral of the story. The emotional reinforcement of moral boundaries. So the cultural embeddedness of our categorizing and recategorizing. I connected that with femininity. We were also talking about this uh yeah, this deep embeddedment of our ethno-ecological categories. It's by telling these stories and myths about different places and literally going to these places, this a kind of mythic network of literally different places in the land. And what is the meaning? What is the significance of those places? What natural knowledge do we have that relates to them? We were doing this before the Holocene. And so that enabled this way of telling stories and updating those stories and deeply connecting through the land, through our storytelling, through our myth making. That's what allowed us to survive this period of climactic instability, all these ice ages before the Holocene. Again, the Holocene is about the last 12,000 years. It's this period of like radical climactic stability. Things have been really chill in the climate for about 12,000 years. And before that, we had a lot of warming and cooling and warming and cooling for a long time, like 10 ice ages or something. And we almost didn't survive that period. And the way that we did survive that period is through all the stuff that we've been talking about. Yeah, classification and the how specialized or how general those classifications can be emerges from the core of culture. We have these trade-offs between efficiency, going up, like the more simple we make our categories, the more efficient we can be in the world, and sort of the more context invariant we can be. The simpler our categories, the more different contexts those categories are going to work in, right? Whereas the more specific we are, the more specific our categories, the more differentiated, well, the more context local, the more we're going to fit into each different environment. And there's a trade-off between those. And it's again, our social sharing of knowledge, our updating of categories, our updating of what things are by shared sensation, shared verification, shared inference. That's how we do that. Okay, I think I'm going to pause this and come back to the final section, which is we're getting toward, yeah, as we still have more to go. It's about what is the like essentially when we started farming, as in the agrarian revolution, what changed? How did the that classifying? Well, we basically what I'm going to say is that is this we saw it's this from the middle outwards. The image of this would be like the hearth with the fire in the middle. We can sort of go up toward the too abstract and the context invariant, which is this. Uh, Yeah, this is it's too global and not local enough, right? Whereas if we become too specific, then we can't, it's not very efficient at all. It's like too energetically costly. It's too local and not global enough. There are failure conditions on either end. And basically we sort of explored one of them earlier on with this relationship between tool making and uh, hand use that talked about this sort of falling away from the center of human cognition toward it's actually towards autism and toward um, technical reasoning and relating to objects rather than beings, being out of touch essentially with the world. And We're going to see another one of them here. This is again that was connected with this a technical change, an innovation in our techne that allowed for this feedback to generate between the left hemisphere and our tool making, tool proliferation, and our hand use. There's going to be another one here in the agrarian revolution. We're going to explore how our naming, how our categorizing changed when we started farming, and we're also going to explore a bit about wayfinding, embodied cognition, and then give a yeah, a few more. There were sort of, I'm going to summarize these key transitions that happened over the past sort of 2 million years or so, that enable us to connect these anatomical changes and the changes in our culture before we hit up a conclusion. So hopefully just one more of these. Thanks for being with me if you're still here. Bye.